Hi, everybody. It's Adam Elenbaas from Nightlight Astrology. Today is Monday, October 8th, and I'm making a week worth of videos for everyone because I'm going to be out of town. So in this video, we're going to be looking at the entrance of Mercury into the sign of Scorpio and its immediate opposition to Uranus, which happens this week. So let's go ahead and take a look. All right. So again, I'm doing these videos because I'm going to be out of town this week, and it's a huge week astrologically. So it should be an interesting week to be on a yoga and meditation retreat. But I will, try to leave some breadcrumbs for people so that you can follow the trail of these transits throughout the week. So we talked about the new moon, which if you haven't listened to, make sure you listen to my new moon talk on Libra for this week. You'll see that the exact opposition between Mercury and Uranus is taking place very late in the evening on October 9th. That's tomorrow night. And you'll see that Mercury is opposite Uranus from Scorpio to Taurus. So let's talk about this briefly and what you can expect. So Mercury is, of course, Hermes, the only god that can go into the underworld and come back kind of untouched. Mercury, the psychopomp, Mercury that can be either masculine or feminine, either play for the sun's team or the moon's team in ancient astrology. Mercury that is in Hermes, who is actually the mythical founder of astrology, Hermes Trismegistus. And you have the god of interpretation, hermeneutics, messages and messengers, writing, thinking, communicating. But also Mercury can be quite lyrical, poetic, like Shakespeare or a singer-songwriter. Mercury is in some ways the trickster and can do a lot of different things, but is intimately related to also skill development, craft, technical abilities, the rational mind. So with Mercury entering Scorpio, first of all, the conversation's about to get a little bit deep, emotionally palpable in Scorpio, and also a little bit more edgy or confrontational with Mercury being in a Mars ruled sign. So we're ready to feel very deeply and for the mind and the emotional and instinctual body to be really open, especially sort of subtle emotional dynamics in communication with others, more pronounced. The ability to read between the lines is going to go up a bit. The desire to talk about things that are deep, pleasing, but challenging on some level. The mind is going to be potentially a little lusty because it's getting into the mix of a Mars ruled sign with Venus in Scorpio. Venus, of course, retrograde right now in Scorpio. So Mercury is, it's sort of like that deep conversation that you're not sure. It's like kind of like a game of truth or dare. It's like, but it's all probably in some levels, it's all truth, or it's the evasion of wanting to tell the truth. It's the desire to remain hidden, secretive. It's tight-lipped. It's holding back. It's careful. It's a little guarded. But there's something that also wants to come out that's stirring, like a pot that's ready to boil. It has that kind of feeling to it. So Mercury in Scorpio is traditionally, all the water signs were called mute and also prolific. But Mercury is going to make things grow in Scorpio. It's going to grow whatever it touches in water sign. So it's very fertile, fluid time for the mind. Make a lot of connections, a lot of ideas growing in the mind right now. And it's substantive, transformative, deep, authentic, possibly cutting, confrontation emotionally is possible. So that's Mercury in Scorpio. You can learn, skill acquisition, philosophical thinking, all very deep right now. Analytical abilities are deep, but also embodied, instinctual, very feminine. And then once Mercury enters Scorpio, basically in the next 24 hours or so, then it's going to oppose Uranus. And Uranus is, of course, a planet that is related to rebellion, innovation, sudden disruption, shocking events, challenges to the status quo, being eccentric, being different, being in some ways even disrespectful towards authority or tradition. So when you get those two involved in an opposition, first of all, you are thinking about the whether is it, the question that comes up is it appropriate or not to be mentally, intellectually, or communicatively rebellious? There might be some question. There might be the desire to be guarded, kept in, feeling like you can't say something, but then also the temptation or the desire to sort of explode and say the thing that nobody else wants to say, or talk about that topic with a friend that you've been meaning to talk about for a while, but that's been kind of pent up, or that you've been both dodging or sort of tiptoeing around. So that kind of walking on eggshells, and then also that idea of like just lighting the fire and sitting down and saying, let's do this, let's really let's really go beyond what we think we're capable of, or what we think we should or shouldn't do. So subversive communication, challenging, rebellious communication, the epiphanies that can go on in your head can be pretty incredible. Just mental, intellectual epiphanies. The topic of the nervous system as well. The nervous system, the mind, issues or challenges with the nervous system or mental energy, restless and potentially sort of perturbed mental energy. Be a bad time to do a lot of uppers, caffeine, nicotine, a good time to potentially kick some of those things as well. But the withdrawal could be really intense. You could feel sort of like you're high and sort of like buzzing, even though you've not done anything or taken any kind of substance into your body. So you just kind of feel the feeling of being sort of plugged in and sort of electrified, especially mentally and emotionally and in communication. Now, questioning authority in inventing new ideas is a beautiful thing, right? So many major developments in all different kinds of fields, from math and science and the arts and humanities, comes when we dare to question the status quo. So this is potentially a very good moment to do so, to break through an old barrier mentally or emotionally. And yet you have to be very careful, because this is the kind of transit that can be about, because Venus retrograde is involved really closely in Scorpio, it's kind of like, do you want to burn a bridge? Do you want to get into a conflict in your relationship because you just can't hold yourself back mentally or verbally, or you have to poke at that one thing that maybe, is there a way of doing it tactfully? A conversation may need to be had, or it may be destiny to just have some kind of explosive mental or intellectual moment. It may be destiny. But with Venus retrograde involved, you can bet that the topic of relationships, challenges in relationships surrounding your values versus my values, independence versus dependence, independent thinking versus cooperative thinking, or what you allow to influence you versus how you stand on your own. One thing that I'll say that just as a challenge is that in our culture, there's a few things that we struggle with. One is that we struggle with the belief that what makes me spiritual is my ability to create my own spirituality, right? Like, I'm not into religion. I'm spiritual, not religious. That's kind of like a hashtag that everyone, spiritual, not religious, it's an easy hashtag of everyone, and that comes from, of course, feeling as though there are multiple paths to truth, or that there are multiple expressions of divinity, and that you don't want to exclude anyone or anything. But and that's fair. So all of that's fair. Plus, what to speak of people who have been damaged by overly dogmatic, rigid, or sort of fundamentalist religious thinking. So all of that creates within us this sense of like, I'm doing my own thing here. Totally fine. But on the other hand, the shadow of that is that when it comes to finding teachers, finding a tradition and substantive practices and lineages that can help hold us accountable, give us teachers that can instruct us, that can correct us, that can be a source of constructive, positive feedback in our lives, or that can get us outside of our own head, and the way in which, if we're only walking our own self-constructed path spiritually, it's very easy to also cheat. And it's very easy to also there's no one to hold us accountable. And so we can offer all sorts of justifications and excuses. And it's very hard to be your own monitor, your own teacher, your own, everything. So maybe the radical idea of Mercury opposite Uranus in some ways, with Venus involved, is also, can I allow myself to be led, guided, influenced, persuaded by something that's positive or helpful? And can I surrender my need to be just in a cage of my own mental, spiritual independence? Because sometimes that's what it is. It's just a cage. Of course, there's the other side of the story, which we also mentioned. But that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is that we also tend to believe very strongly that because there are so many different options in the world, ways of thinking about things, because we can see from so many different perspectives or consider so many different perspectives, we assume that truth is totally relative, that we assume that, truth is what you make of it. And this is also problematic. In some ways, this is something that comes along with consumerism. We have so many options. We can buy whatever we want. We can exercise our freedom to spend our money in whatever way we want. So we are entitled to all different kinds of private delights. Well, whatever I buy and choose to do with my resources, my time, my money, that creates my own private experience. And so again, the radical part of this teaching, with Mercury, Venus retrograde, Jupiter all in Scorpio, Mercury opposing Uranus and Taurus, is, can I open myself to the idea that there is a truth that is in some sense objective, that is in some sense greater than my subjective preferences, my sort of subjective needs and wishes. And we get very protective about that, because our culture is set up to basically protect but also isolate our ego by giving it a huge amount of options about what it can consume. And then we define happiness in terms of what my choices are for consumption. And so truth gets extended into that paradigm. What is true is whatever I wish to be true, because it's related to whatever I wish to buy and consume that can somehow serve me and my need for temporary happiness that's, really pretty fleeting. So can we consider a truth that's outside, that somehow, penetrates through the barriers of isolation, and it speaks to us somehow? Maybe that's in hearing somebody else's truth and hearing that it's objectively true, even though subjectively I'm like, well, that's not my truth. How do we open ourselves up to a truth that's bigger than just our own private little cage? And I'm not suggesting one particular way, but the consideration of what is objective truth versus the tendency to be overly subjective in truth. That's something that's there to consider as well. One thing that a lot of the times we don't realize about the mind, this is the third thing, is that the mind is, according to yoga philosophy, the mind is capable of arguing and deconstructing and searching and probing and considering and dissecting and analyzing endlessly. Just because it is material in nature, the mind is part of materiality. And so its relation to the material world is its ability to count, divide, again, compare, judge, evaluate things in the material world. And it can do so endlessly because the material world is thought to be endlessly fluctuating, always has been, always will be, just kind of goes through these cycles. And so in that regard, a lot of the times people also say, well, you can sort of endlessly analyze things. So in the end of the day, there is no truth, or there is no, there is nothing that I ultimately have to be committed to. Spiritual life, a lot of the times people then will say, well, it takes faith to be spiritual. which is true. There is something about spiritual life that requires faith on any level. But we should talk about what faith's relationship is to the mind a little bit. So the mind, very simply, you could think of it like this. For the mind to come to rest and commit itself to a truth that we believe in, the mind, in a sense, has to recognize its own limitations. Rather than saying, well, everything's endlessly perspectival and everything's endlessly analyzable. You can kind of go nuts forever mentally, so there's no truth. Instead, what the mind recognizes in a faith commitment is that the mind, that is the nature of the mind. That the nature of the mind is to endlessly analyze, and so one says the mind is limited in that way. The mind can't arrive at the final singular truth of everything. It gets frustrated doing so, and then in order for the ego to build a sense of being protected, strong, and that's how we imagine happiness. I'm protected and I'm strong. I've got what I want. I need what, this is me. The mind is extended and into the world and says, as long as I can analyze and, do this kind of stuff, constantly thinking my way through reality. And that becomes a part of how the ego sets up its little fortress. But, and then what the mind does when it sees, well, everything is endlessly analyzed, you can think and dissect everything endlessly, is it sets up a philosophy based on that. It says, well, because it values the mind above everything else. And of course, it's valuing itself. So when the mind values itself above everything else and it sees that everything is endlessly analyzed, then you can set up a philosophy that says, well, because everything is endlessly analyzed, there is no truth. And so that becomes the philosophy that the mind sticks to. It's self-reinforcing, and then that helps the ego stay protected. But when the mind recognizes that actually I'm limited, I can't think my way to truth, then the mind surrenders to something deeper, a deeper state of intelligence. And the intelligence is able to judge between things in relation to our consciousness and our heart. And so it says, meditating feels good, right? Meditating quiets my mind. Prayer does this or does that. And so the mind starts surrendering to an intelligence that is greater than itself. It's not exactly rational, but it's not irrational either. The mind can be used in service to spiritual realizations, to spiritual life, but it has to surrender on some level to what the heart and soul is speaking and saying, hey, this feels good to me, so this is what I'm going to stand on. This is the ground that I stand on. When you stand on that ground, that's your faith. You're saying, I have faith that this experience is good and true and creates harmony or happiness for me on a higher level than what the mind and just material reality can do for me. And again, at which point the mind becomes the best friend. It becomes the servant. It becomes something that starts studying and using the mind to help shape your understanding of whatever you can know mentally about what you're doing spiritually. It will help shape it. You can study about meditation. You can study the sacred scriptures. You can, study astrology. You can study these things, but the mind is studying them in service to the faith ground that the heart has established as the most important, the axiomatic truth, the truth that I feel and I know in a place that's different from my mind. So the surrender of the mind in that sense is necessary for a faith path to lead us. So in this sense, this is a big one, but the reason I'm saying this is because with Mercury opposite Uranus, there's the potential for a mental breakthrough. That's great. But again, if all we're doing is having mental breakthroughs in the world and we're trying to manipulate our world based solely on the idea that the mind is supreme, and the tendency for that belief that the mind is supreme is to arrive at the conclusion that nothing is true because the mind can endlessly dissect and analyze. So again, if that's the path we're going down, then this transit might entail some kind of mental, intellectual, organizational breakthroughs or epiphanies, but what will they really be in service to? Nothing, because the mind does that stuff endlessly, one lifetime after the next, until finally the mind recognizes, oh, there's no truth in this. There's no truth that I can finally arrive at or stand on, like there is when I feel in my heart and in my soul something that's good for me, and I stand on it in faith, and then my mind becomes the servant of that faith journey. So there's a possibility for an intellectual breakthrough right now, but in a deeper sense, an intellectual breakthrough that is in service to our spiritual lives. What does that look like? So that's what I wanted to talk about. Sorry if that was a little bit messy philosophically, but hopefully the point came across okay. I'm going to make one more video on the Venus-Mars square for this week as well. So that's what I've got for now. I hope you guys enjoy this Uranus opposite or Mercury opposite Uranus transit, and let me know how it goes.